We all think we know our neighbors, but after hearing this, you might start looking out your windows a little differently. These stories will chill your spine. It started with something simple. My neighbor Charles came to me one day asking to borrow a shovel. Now, I've lent him things before. A drill, a ladder, no big deal. And I didn't think anything of it then, even though it was late at night. Charles's son had gone missing years back, something that shook the neighborhood. He and his wife never recovered. Kathy went quiet and brittle, and Charles turned strange and paranoid, always looking over his shoulder, never quite meeting anyone's gaze. But that was understandable, or so I told myself. Anyway, he thanked me and took the shovel without a word, heading back to his yard. I thought he'd be done with it the next morning, but he didn't return it. I went to look for him and saw him digging in his backyard, a deep, wide hole. He looked up at me, and something cold, something dark, flickered across his face. "I've got it," he snapped when I offered to help. There was no explanation, just that chill in his voice, and for some reason, it unnerved me enough that I left without arguing. That night, I kept catching myself glancing out my window toward his yard, watching him work. After a while, he stopped digging and began looking around, eyes flicking from window to window, checking if anyone was watching. I ducked behind my curtains, my heart pounding. He'd caught me. The next day, he avoided me completely, and by the time I finally worked up the nerve to sneak back over and take a look, the hole was filled, the ground leveled as if nothing had happened. And still, no shovel. Days later, I caught Charles staring at my house through his window. The memory of that cold look returned, and I suddenly wondered if I was the one being watched all along. We were about to move. Finally, after years in that god-awful neighborhood, we were going somewhere better. There was just one problem, and it came in the form of two strange boys who lived next door, Todd and Eric. I didn't know them well. No one did. They were reclusive, quiet, and angry in that way that always set you on edge. One day, just before the move, Todd invited me and my younger brother to come shoot BB guns with them down by the river. I agreed, figuring it was harmless, but when we got there, they pulled out real guns instead. My brother looked terrified. I tried to keep my cool, took my brother's gun out of his hands, and left. I knew we'd never see them again, so it didn't matter if they were angry. That night I was jolted awake by a hand pressed against the back of my head. I froze, recognizing Todd's voice in a low, menacing whisper. "Tell anyone about today, and I'll come back for you and your family." I barely whispered, "Okay," before he disappeared through the window. I thought I could finally breathe again. But every night for the rest of that week, I'd catch him or Eric at their window, watching me. When we finally moved, I tried to put it behind me. Years passed and they faded into memory, until a few weeks ago, I was at my kitchen window, and there, in the house next door, I saw a shadow, a figure peering back at me. They'd followed me. I still don't know if they were real that night or something else entirely. When I moved into that house, I knew I was in for an adjustment. The place was cheap, old, and falling apart. But worse than the condition of the house were the neighbors, specifically the women who lived next door. One of them, older and silent, kept to herself. But the younger woman, her daughter or niece, maybe, had the most terrifying eyes I'd ever seen. She'd scream at strange hours, clawing at her own front door, her face twisted in a horrible kind of glee whenever she caught sight of me. One night, they were particularly loud, yelling and banging. I finally stomped over and banged on the door, hoping to quiet them down. The older woman answered, giving me a look so cold I swear I could feel the temperature drop. Then the younger woman burst into the hallway, glaring at me with a crazed look before the door slammed in my face. I thought maybe they'd settled down afterward since it went quiet, so I went back to bed. But then I heard something moving. In the darkness, a cold presence filled the room. My heart stopped when my eyes adjusted just enough to make out a face at the edge of my bed. Her face. I scrambled to the door as she started screaming, something almost inhuman tearing from her throat as she lunged toward me. I called the cops and hid in the kitchen until they arrived. They took her away, but as the officers led her out, the older woman stood there, just outside her front door, watching me with that same dark glare. She didn't say a word, but I know she's waiting, just like her daughter. And I'm terrified of the day when they both come back. It all started with a strange sound in the middle of the night, a shovel scraping against earth. I looked out my bedroom window to see my neighbor, an older man named Charles, digging a hole in his backyard. I tried not to make assumptions, tried to ignore the strange way he looked around to make sure no one was watching. But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I waited until he'd gone back inside and quietly crept over to his yard. There, in the dim moonlight, I saw something black sticking out from the bottom of the hole. It looked like a garbage bag, tied up tight. My heart pounded, a million explanations racing through my mind, none of them good. I thought about digging it up. But just as I reached out, I heard footsteps. I barely made it back to my own yard before Charles came back outside, carrying something heavy. I stayed up that night, eyes glued to his yard. But by morning, the hole was gone, filled in as if nothing had happened. Days passed, and though I tried to forget, something gnawed at me. What had he buried? Was it his son's body finally laid to rest? Or something else? Weeks later, I caught him watching me through his window, his face hidden behind the blinds. He knew I'd been there, and maybe he knew that now. Every night, I couldn't sleep, feeling like I was the one buried inch by his gaze. How about you? What would you do in a situation like that? If you have any creepy neighbor story, let us know.